Hi, everybody. This is Daniel Karapkin speaking to you from Thornhill, Ontario, on behalf of webyeshiva.org. We are studying Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed, the Rambam's Moreh Nevukhim. We are in section 3, the final section of the guide, and we are studying today chapter 42. We are in the middle of the Rambam's explanation of what is called Ta'ameh HaMitzvot, explaining the reasons for each of the mitzvot. And the way that the Rambam has chosen to set out doing this is to divide the 613 commandments into 14 separate categories. And each category has a certain theme or a goal as to how it's going to help perfect either the individual or the social order, which will ultimately trickle down to the benefit of the individual. And ultimately, that is the reason why God gave us the mitzvot. He gave us the commandments so that we could be perfected beings, to become as close to God as possible. And the Rambam's ultimate objective, as what he sees as what is the ultimate objective of the mitzvot, is to give every human being the opportunity to perfect his or her intellect so that they can become ultimately close to the Almighty. So with this in mind, I'm going to share the handout for today. Chapter 42 is a shorter chapter, so we should be able to finish it without having to feel that we've been a little rushed. I apologize because I felt that in chapter 41, I felt that I had to speak quickly and I was a bit rushed, and perhaps we should have spent another session on it. But be that as it may, we're now going into chapter 42, financial regulations. Now, just to get our bearings where we are, this chapter covers the seventh category out of the Rambam's 14 categories of the mitzvot that he had detailed in chapter 35. And I want to remind you that the Rambam had said that 3 out of the 14 categories are exclusively devoted to Bein Adam Lechavero issues. And the reason why God gave us mitzvot that are Bein Adam Lechavero, between man and his fellow man, the interchanges that we have on a social basis, are because the Torah seeks to regulate peaceful and harmonious societies and social orders. And this is necessary in order for man to achieve his ultimate goal of intellectual perfection. So, in giving a brief overview of this category, if you recall back in chapter 35, which is on page 536 in the Pines edition, the Rambam had foreshadowed for us a brief synopsis of what each category of the 14 categories was all about. And we're just quoting from what he writes in chapter 35. He says the seventh class comprises those laws which regulate the business transactions of men with each other. So, for example, laws about loans, hire, trust, buying, selling, and the like. The rules about inheritance belong to this class. We have described these precepts in the sections called Sefer Kinyan and Sefer Mishpatim. And we'll get to that in just a moment. The object of these precepts is evident, for monetary transactions are necessary for the peoples of all countries, and it is impossible to have these transactions without a proper standard of equity and without useful regulations. So there's a whole series of mitzvot that regulate how people are supposed to interact with each other financially. And that's what this chapter is all about. And the Rambam is going to extract 4 specific mitzvot out of many more mitzvot that fall into this category. And he's going to demonstrate for us how these mitzvot help regulate financial interaction. So we start off with the introduction. This category covers Dinei Mamonut, financial laws, all laws having to do with finance. These laws are covered in the Mishnah Torah in portions of the books called Sefer Kinyan, which literally means the book of transaction, and Sefer Mishpatim, the book of judgments. Okay, the reason for these laws is evident. These laws address transactions that occur regularly within society. The Torah wishes to create justice for both sides of the transaction so that each party benefits and neither party is exploited. And if we did not have a Torah, there might be many societies that could come up with their own systems of commerce, free enterprise. But if there are no regulations that put brakes on free enterprise, this could result in the exploitation of a person who is not as experienced in these kinds of financial dealings. And so the Torah seeks to avoid the exploitation of the other and one person gaining at the expense of another. The Rambam will cover 4 types of mitzvot of this genre in this chapter. As we will conclude this chapter, since we have a little bit more time today because of the shorter length of this chapter, we'll examine what the Rambam leaves on the table from these 2 aforementioned books of Mishnah Torah and why they were not discussed here. So the Rambam is going to discuss 4 mitzvot. So the first one is the prohibition of ona'ah. That is oppressing someone by exploiting them through either the seller overcharging or the buyer underpaying. The details of these laws are covered in the Mishnah Torah in Hilchot Mechira, the laws of sale, in Sefer Kinyan in the Book of Transaction. And as we've explained before, the Mishnah Torah is 14 different books, and each book has a series of volumes. So, for example, you have the Book of Transaction, and within the Book of Transaction, you have 5 different books, and one of them is Laws of Sales. Okay, now conditions are built into the law to determine when a sale is valid, and when significant onah has taken place, the sale is voided. And generally speaking, the law states as follows. If I overcharge a customer by charging him more than 1/6 of the fair market value of the merchandise, then the customer is entitled to a refund to bring it down to fair market value, and I have to pay him back whatever I have overcharged him. If I charge him more than 1/6, then the customer has a right to nullify the sale entirely and to get a complete refund and completely void the sale. Now, included in this prohibition is ona'at devarim, says the Rambam, as is well known. Now, this is a prime example of how the Torah does not just care about the financial exploitation of another, but by extension, the Torah is concerned about any kind of exploitation of one person that is done by another. And how can I exploit other people? I can exploit other people who are not as adept, as savvy, as intellectual or intelligent as I am, and I can do that by swindling them financially, but I could also do it by harming them emotionally, by insulting them, by telling them things that are not in their best interests and misrepresenting the fact that I don't care about them and telling them falsely that I do care about them. This is all considered to be a form of exploitation, which the Torah seeks to address. And again, this is one of the ways where we see that the Torah goes the extra measure from general social structures that are put into place by every country. A country may have financial law in place, but it's not going to have the law of ona'at devarim, where the Torah tells me that I'm not allowed to verbally oppress somebody by insulting them and telling them things that are going to ultimately be harmful for them. As a matter of fact, we all grew up with the poem, "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never harm me." And that simply isn't true according to the Torah attitude. Torah says Hashem does care about even the verbal exploitation of another person. And the Rambam deals with this again in Hilchot Mechira, just in a different chapter, in chapter 14 of Hilchot Mechira. And he writes, Keshem shahonaya b'mekach u'memkar, just like there is oppression or exploitation of another person, b'mekach u'memkar, kach yesh honaya bidvarim. The same applies to verbal assault or oppression. Shenemar v'lo tonu ishet amito, because the Torah says a second time that no person may oppress his fellow. V'yareta me elokecha ani Hashem, and you must fear your God, I am the Lord. The reason why it says you must fear your God is because a person could fool everyone else and say, well, I only told him innocently something that I thought would be in his best interests, when in reality it wasn't. Zeh honayat devarim. This refers to verbal assault, and it is something that even if human beings can be fooled to think that I didn't have malicious intent. God sees what is in my heart. So the Rambam gives two examples. He says, or in two actual paragraphs, he says, for an example would be if a person was a Baal Tshuva, if a person was a returnee to Judaism, Lo Yomar Lo Zechor Ma'asecha Harishonim. It's forbidden to say to him, publicly, certainly not, and even privately, oh, you remember how you used to eat non-kosher food, you remember how you used to be Machal Shabbos and so forth. That's hurtful to a person. Or if a person is descended from converts, don't say, well, your ancestors were natives in Africa running around trees and painting themselves. In other words, you're not supposed to say things that are going to hurt people's feelings. If a person is going through suffering in life, you shouldn't say, like Eob's friend said to him, oh, it must be that you've done something wrong and that's why God is punishing you. These are all very harmful words that are going to end up exploiting someone and making them feel terrible about themselves. The other halacha, more related to finance, is if a person asks you for financial advice and you give them advice that you know is going to be to their detriment, and you misrepresent yourself as really sincerely trying to help them, and you misrepresent yourself as being an expert in the field when you're really not, this all is in the category of onaas devarim, of verbal oppression or exploitation, and it's not actionable, but it's still prohibited by the Torah. So that's the first category. The second category, and again, keep in mind that all of the mitzvot that the Rambam is detailing throughout the 14 categories are mitzvot that are designed to help improve either the social order or the individual character. Second, the laws of the four Shomrim. The four Shomrim are discussed extensively in the tractates Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, and Bava Batra, the three Bavas. So those of you who study Gemara will be very familiar with these terms. There's the Shomer Chinam, the unpaid guard, which is basically if someone comes over to me and says, would you mind taking care of my dog over the weekend? And I say, sure, I'm happy to watch your dog as a favor to you. So I have a certain level of liability, but because I'm doing it for free, my liability is more limited. Then you have the Shomer Sachar. If someone asks me to watch their dog and they'll pay me, so that's called a paid guard. Then you have the socher, who is a person who rents property from another person, or what is called a lessor in more technical language. And then you have a shoel, who is a borrower. And the borrower has the highest level of liability because he's getting pure benefit and the other guy's doing him a favor. So if a mishap occurs, then the shoel is almost always going to be liable for any kind of loss or damage that is caused to the property. Now, the Torah is a fair system, holding more liable the party who receives more benefit and less liable the party who receives less benefit. Thus, the Shomer Chinam, the person who does a favor by watching over someone's property for free, is not held liable, and even though the Rambam doesn't say this, it's clear from the Talmud, except in cases of real negligence, since he derives no benefit and is rather doing an act of chesed, an act of kindness. The shoel, the borrower, is precisely the opposite, bearing responsibility for all mishaps to the property borrowed, including cases of onus, complete accident. So even if, for example, lightning strikes the dog that I borrowed, I'm going to be, if I needed to borrow a dog for whatever reason, or more reasonably, if I needed to borrow my friend's lawnmower to trim my grass, and all of a sudden lightning strikes it and it becomes a heap of molten mass, I'm still liable, even though that was an act of God. The reason is because my liability increases as my benefit increases and the benefit to the owner decreases. Now, the middle two categories, the Shomer Sachar and the Socher, the paid guard and the renter, has limited liability. And the reason is because both parties, both the owner and the lessor or the watcher, benefit. If I'm renting something from someone, if I'm renting your lawnmower, you benefit because I'm giving you cash for your lawnmower. I benefit because I get use of your lawnmower. So there's mutual benefit, and therefore the liability has to be shared between both parties. The shomer, therefore, is liable for theft and loss, where he bears some level of negligence for not having sufficiently protected the property, whereas the owner is liable in cases of onus, where there was nothing for the shomer to do to prevent the mishap. So what the Rambam is using is demonstrating with this set of laws having to do with the four levels of liability and responsibility, is showing how the Torah is a fair system designed to protect the rights of every citizen, of every individual within the society, and to make sure that no person is unfairly exploited or unfairly gains through his greed at the expense of another. The third example that the Rambam gives is that great kindness must be shown to the day laborer, the sachir, since the Torah assumes that he must work due to his poverty. If a person's a landowner and they're wealthy, they don't have to hire themselves out as a day laborer to other people. The fact that a person has to go out and get a job by doing daily work for other people, even though he's getting paid at the end of the day, indicates that there's some level of economic disadvantage that he has vis-a-vis his employer. And therefore, the Torah is very careful to warn the employer to treat the laborer fairly and not to oppress him, and to make sure that he gets paid properly for his work. So this is explicit in the Torah in Deuteronomy chapter 24. The Torah says, Lo ta'ashok sachir, you may not oppress the laborer. And notice how the Torah calls him ani ve'evyon. He is poor and downtrodden. And the Torah is making an assumption, as I said, that anyone who has to hire themselves out is more economically disadvantaged. And an example of how you have to treat him fairly is biyomoti tein scharo, that you must pay him by the end of the day. If he's hired himself out to work for you for Monday, you've got to pay him before the sun sets on Monday. You've got to give him his wages before you send him home. This, unfortunately, is a law that many Jews are not familiar with, and they will hire someone to work for them and will not pay them when payment is due right away. And they rationalize to themselves that this guy needs the money, and I've got him where I want him. He can come back tomorrow and get the paycheck. But that in reality is a violation of an explicit verse in the Torah. He must be paid on time, and he must be paid for the true value of his service. Part of the compassion that is shown to him is that if he is working in the field, he is permitted to eat from the produce he's harvesting. The Torah considers it an act of cruelty that if a guy is harvesting grapes, that he shouldn't be allowed to, on a hot day, nibble on some grapes to be able to replenish his hydration and to get some more energy to continue working. It's also he becomes more hungry for grapes because he's working with them. So, and the Torah says the same thing, that when you're working with an animal, you may not, and the animal is harvesting edible product, you may not muzzle the animal. The animal has to be permitted to nibble. And this again is the Torah showing great compassion, making sure that there is a proper social order. Number 4, and this is the final mitzvah that the Rambam addresses in this chapter, is included in financial regulation of the laws of inheritance. And surprisingly, the Rambam takes the position that it is only just and fair that a testator, a person who has an estate and is going to shortly pass away, that they are obligated based on a moral code to leave some kind of inheritance for his heirs. Now, I want to underscore first and foremost that this is a very complicated set of laws, and that one should not derive any kind of halachic ruling from our discussion today of chapter 42 of the guide, simply because the Rambam refers us to the Mishnah Torah when we want to be able to derive halacha. And certainly even post Mishnah Torah, that you have the Shulchan Aruch and all of its commentaries. And it's really, really important to have clarity on what every person's rights are, both the rights of the heir and the rights of the testator. But when you look thematically at what the Rambam is telling us, he's telling us the theme of the mitzvah, because his whole objective is to depict how each mitzvah of the Torah promotes moral behavior that will ultimately allow a person to become intellectually perfect and completely bond with God. So the laws of inheritance are designed for the same reason. And it's not immediately evident why that is. but he says involves a lofty moral quality, namely that a person should not deprive goodness from someone who is deserving. And the assumption that the Rambam makes is that if I have children, my children deserve a portion of my or all of my estate. Just because a person is dying does not give him the right to look askance upon his heirs. He thus does not have the right to disperse his assets to others before his death, but should rather leave it for his kin, who are, I'm just quoting, are more worthy of receiving it than others. Now, again, as I said, that's not self evident. What if a person has children who are ne'er-do-wells and they abandon the parent and they leave him in a home, or they don't do anything for the parent, and the parent has to rely on the kindness of friends and sometimes even strangers. And therefore, out of a feeling of gratitude, he wants to leave his estate to people who are not his children, who did not treat him well, who ignored him, who forsook him. And so, but what the Rambam is saying is speaking in generalities. As a general rule, family takes care of family. And if my children take care of me in my old age, and they had to endure certain indignities as I was raising them, because I raised my voice with them and I made them do chores for the household, they should be in some way acknowledged for their sacrifices that they made for the sake of family. And that acknowledgement comes in the form of an inheritance of the estate. Now, I do want to point out that from a halachic standpoint, it is permitted for any testator to give away as much charity as he or she wishes before they pass away. It is, however, important not to leave the estate completely barren. You have to leave something for your heirs, but that doesn't mean that you have to leave everything for your heirs. If a person wishes to give away a very large portion of his estate to charity, leaving a sufficient amount for his heirs to get something of substance, that's also perfectly legal. But the Rambam does not go there. And a person really would have to examine these halachot in the Mishnah Torah and the later commentaries in order to get further clarity. The Torah details a hierarchy of relatives. The highest heir is the offspring, is one's son. Then, if a person is childless, the next closest family member would be a brother. And if a person is both childless and without siblings, then his paternal uncle would be the heir and would inherit the estate. Again, working under the assumption, the general rule, that family takes care of family. A person must also give the firstborn double portion to the true firstborn instead of following his whims of giving to his favorite, as it is written explicitly in Deuteronomy chapter 21, Lo yuchal levaker et ben ha'ahuva al pnei ben hasanua habechor. And no testator, no father has a right to basically say, well, I like my younger child because he's from my second wife who I had a better relationship with, so I'm only going to give a regular portion to my firstborn from my first wife, and I'll give something nicer to my secondborn who's from my second wife. You don't have a right to do that according to the Torah. Now, this ostensibly is for the same reason. A firstborn son is endowed with additional responsibilities. He's got to take care of the younger siblings. The father assumes he's going to work harder than all of the other siblings. He may have to endure even more indignities from the parent because he's the firstborn, and therefore he deserves more. That's the general attitude that the Rambam seems to be communicating. I should point out that even great biblical characters like Yaakov Avinu did not give his true firstborn a double portion. He took away the double portion from his firstborn son Reuven and gave it instead to his favorite son Yosef, who was the firstborn from his more beloved wife Rachel. And that seems to be a direct contradiction to the law that you're not allowed to show favoritism to a more beloved child for whatever reason. And so the commentaries discuss in great length, starting from the Talmud, going to the various commentaries on the Torah, what the justification can be in order to deprive a firstborn from his double portion. So we're not going to go into that right now, but suffice it to say that the Rambam is sketching for us the themes, the moral themes behind the mitzvot, but is not ruling the halacha for us in this chapter. Now, this moral trait of leaving inheritance for heirs and maintaining a connection with them is exhorted and emphasized in the Torah exceedingly. You know what the prophet states about this priority because it says in the book of Proverbs written by Solomon, Gomel nafsho ish chesed, a person who gives of himself is a man of chesed, is a man of kindness. But va'ocher she'ero achzari, but he who forsakes or harms his relatives, that's a cruel person. So it's clear from scripture that it's important to take care of family. The Torah, too, when speaking about charity, says that one must prioritize his family from Deuteronomy chapter 15, which is talking about charity to the poor. Ki lo yechdal avyon mikerev haaretz. The Torah says there will never be a shortage of poor people in the land. Al kain anochi mitzavach lemor, and therefore I command you on this day, patoach tiftach et yadecha, you shall surely open up your hands to be able to give charity to whom? La'achicha, la'aniyecha, ule'evyonecha be'artzecha, to your brother, to your poor, and to your downtrodden in your land. So you see that the Torah lists first your brother. And so we see from here, and this is codified in the laws of tzedakah, the laws of charity, that if you have to triage and you have only limited amount of money to give for charity, family comes first. And this is why our sages praise the person who brings his relatives close to him and even marries his sister's daughter. That's considered to be an act of compassion and kindness, because my sister may have difficult time marrying off her daughter, and so I will do the chesed of marrying her off. It's quite curious. You know, the Torah lists in Leviticus chapter 18 and also in chapter 20 all of the forbidden incestuous relationships. And the classic case of incest is a brother and a sister. But the Torah calls that form of incest chesedhu, calls it an act of kindness, which means that it originates from a desire to take care of your kin. But it's a distorted desire to take care of your kin because God wishes people to go outside of their families when it's time to procreate. And yet, if it's a cousin or even an uncle and a niece, there is permission granted to marry, and sometimes the Gemara considers that to be virtuous, that I take care of my family. So it's a bit of a delicate balance. Now, as I point out in the notes, the deservedness of a family member receiving one's inheritance may be due to the importance of showing proper gratitude to those family members who in the past came to one's aid. This will become apparent when the Rambam discusses the spurning of the Egyptian, which we'll learn in just a moment. Furthermore, it's important to note what the Rambam wrote in chapter 41 when discussing the Torah's prohibition of striking or cursing one's parent. We just saw that very recently, a couple of weeks ago, but I just wanted to recall it for you. It's in the Pines edition on page 562. The Rambam gives us two reasons why the Torah gives the death penalty for any person who strikes or curses their parent. He says there is great harm in these acts because of the great impudence of the thing. Number one, because it takes huge chutzpah to do that. And number two, it destroys the good order of the household, which is the first part of the city. And that's a very telling statement. The italics are mine. The point that the Rambam is making is that the basic building block of any social order is a healthy family unit. And in order to maintain healthy families, every Jew should view it as his or her responsibility to make sure that all the members of my family are well taken care of, whether that's financially, emotionally, or otherwise. I have an obligation to look out for my family. Why? Not only because of feelings of gratitude that I would have towards them for things they've done for me in the past, but also because there's an acknowledgement that in order to maintain a healthy society, I have to maintain a healthy family. You can't have a healthy society if families are dysfunctional. And that's a really important lesson for our society to take today. When the nuclear family begins to break down, society breaks down. If the nuclear family is healthy, there's a father, there's a mother, there's children who are properly disciplined and raised, and they are fed and well taken care of, society flourishes. This apparently was well known in the medieval world. It's not as well known today. We seem to have forgotten some of our wisdom. Now, The last thing that we'll mention today is the last part of the chapter. This moral quality that is necessary to have compassion for one's kin extends to those relatives who do him wrong and may be extremely corrupt. What the Rambam says is you got to take care of family, even if they're really bad people, because again, family is family. And to show an example of this, the Rambam demonstrates that the Torah commands us not to spurn the Edomite, not to treat him badly. Why? Ki achichahu, because he is descended from your brother Esav. And so if you recall, when we were traveling through the desert for 40 years and we came closer to the border of Eretz Yisrael, God said to us, we may not harm or molest the Edomite people, even though they were very unkind to us. Why? Because they're mishpacha, they're family. And Esav and Yaakov had a wonderful relationship. They shared both parents, Yitzchak and Rivka. And we have to remember that family is family. So even though they may be rotten to the core, we have to temper our treatment of them, even when they're not nice to us. Obviously, we're allowed to defend ourselves if there's a war, but we have to make sure that we don't go out of our way to harm them. The same thing is true, or a similar feature is true about Egyptians. The Torah says in the very same breath in Deuteronomy chapter 23, Lo teta'iv Mitzri, you may not spurn or treat poorly the Egyptian, ki ger hayita be'artzo, because you were a stranger in his land. If someone showed you compassion and offered you aid in the past, even if now they are cruel to you, you must never forget their past kindness. There was a period of time when the Egyptians were kind to us during the period of when Yosef was the viceroy of Egypt. Paro was very benevolent to the Jews. He allowed us to live during a time of famine in his land. Even though later on they enslaved us, we mustn't forget the kindness of the Egyptians at one point in history. Now, that may sound a little bit jarring. I mean, how would we compare that to Nazi Germany, right? We must be kind to Germans because at one time during the 19th century, they welcomed us into their country and made us part of the social fabric during the Enlightenment. But then they turned us all into concentration camp victims and committed genocide against us. So how far does this prohibition of spurning someone who at one point did a kindness for you? I'm not going to go into that today, but it just does make for an interesting question. Now, these laws of the Edomite and Egyptian are not subsumed in the seventh category, but thematically, in other words, this is not a category for us to discuss these specific laws about how to treat Edomites and Egyptians, because they don't really have anything to do with the structure of a Jewish society. But thematically, they are related in that we see that many mitzvot are designed to engender the proper moral quality of gratitude and acknowledgement of one's kin for the sake of preserving society. Now, the postscript of this chapter is very simply this, and then we'll be done. Note that the Rambam cites two books of Mishnah Torah, Sefer Kinyan, the book of transaction, and Sefer Mishpatim, the book of judgments. These books cover each cover 5 topics for a total of 10. In the book of Kinyan, we have, and you'll notice the things that I bold in the outline are the 4 things that the Rambam, 4 out of 10 topics that the Rambam chooses to cover in this chapter. The Rambam, as I mentioned, only covered Hilchot Mechira, the laws of transactions. Remember, the first thing was, don't exploit another person when you're buying and selling. Hilchot Schirut, don't exploit another person when you're hiring them or renting something of theirs. Hilchot She'ela Ufikadon, borrowing other people's property. We learned about the law of levels of liability. And finally, Hilchot Nachalot, the laws of inheritance. But look at the 5 topics in the book of Kinyan. Yes, it's true, we have Hilchot Mechira, but we also have Hilchot Zichia Umatana, ownership transfers. Hilchot Shchenim, laws of neighbors, what a neighbor's right is if a person's tree is growing into my property, and so forth. Hilchot Shluchim V'Shutafim, partnerships. And Hilchot Avadim, the laws of slave ownership. In the book of Mishpatim, we have, Hilchot Schirut, Hilchot She'ela Ufikadon, but we also have Hilchot Malveh V'Loveh, the laws of loans. We have Hilchot To'en V'Nitan, court processions, and Hilchot Nachalot, laws of inheritance. Only those in the bold are topics of discussion in the chapter. Something that might be worth us pondering is, why did the Rambam choose only these topics of law and not the other topics undertaken in these two books? For example, why didn't the Rambam include in this chapter a discussion of the prohibition of charging interest on loans? Isn't that a way of preventing exploitation of another? Consider the theme of this chapter, which is to engender proper transactional behavior between two parties, showing respect for the other and not exploiting them, and showing proper gratitude and care for one's own family. Perhaps these laws, more than the others contained in these two books, epitomize the Torah's care for the proper maintenance of a harmonious society. It's altogether possible that the reason why the Rambam did not discuss the laws that prohibit taking interest on loans is because a society is capable of thriving even when people pay interest on loans. And so that may not fit in thematically with what he's discussing here, which is laws that were given to the Jewish people specifically to engender proper moral qualities that will, in turn, make for a more robust and healthy society, since everyone will feel that they are treated fairly and are not being exploited. It is particularly these four categories of law that the Rambam feels most represent that idea, even though there are other things that are contained in Sefer Kinyan and Sefer Mishpatim that go well beyond that objective of maintaining a healthy society. So that's really all I wanted to present for you today. I'm going to stop my share. And before we call it a day, are there any questions or comments that anyone would like to make? If not, let me wish you a good week. And let me also let you know that we're going to be taking a break for the next 2 Mondays due to some travels that I have to make because it's wedding season. So we'll meet 3 weeks from today, and that should bring us to, I believe it's the middle of July. I think it's July 15th will probably be our next class 3 weeks from today. So we'll let you know, we'll keep you posted. We encourage you, if you haven't done so already, to join the Facebook group Shiur in Moreh Nevukhim, where you'll get regular updates of the next year. Have a wonderful week, everybody. Take care.